And so if we are people that want to follow a God of justice, we need to be people of justice. And love isn't just rainbows and flowers and puppy dogs and whatever it might be and greeting cards, but it's actually something that is practical, that makes a difference. Often when we start the conversation about justice, we're talking about, political rallies or changing laws, but we all make choices every day in how we treat the people we interact with. So we're not just doing short-term charity all the time, and those things are good, those things are valuable and often necessary, but we also need to step back at times and say, well, actually we're doing this as part of trying to create some better systems in our communities, in our countries, in our world. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is something surely any of us can do. Mm-hmm. The little example task that you give in the book is to... Nathan, many of us feel the tension sometimes between seeing injustice, feeling uncomfortable about injustice. We're watching the news, perhaps it's a radio broadcast, things that might be happening in our community or to our family. But we're often unprepared to pay the price or to make the sacrifice to change it. What's the first step? What advice could you give to somebody who's, facing that situation?
Yeah, I think the first step is noticing, just taking the time, giving the world around us enough attention, and that's a kind of caring in itself, to have that just sensitivity to the world around us, where we're open to that the world is not about us, it's not centered on us, it's actually that others should be the center of particularly our faithful lives, and that's the healthiest way to live. It's the way that's most rewarding for ourselves, but also is most necessary for us to be able to be a useful presence in the world and a faithful presence in the world.
Okay, so let's say, we're aware of that tension in our life, we're looking beyond our own boundaries, we're just not focused on our own life. What should I do then? It seems overwhelming for one person to make any difference in this world.
Yeah.
Can you give me another step of, beyond then being aware? What could one person do?
Yeah. So the next step, I think, is to learn. Something's caught your attention. What can you learn about it? Not just react, but to learn more deeply about it. Now, that may be simply listening, maybe having a conversation with somebody in your community. It may be going to somewhere where people in your community are helped and just listening. What's happening there? What is the actual need? We might see the problem, but what is the sort of underlying need that is the thing that it really needs to be addressed if we're going to make a meaningful change there? It may be, all the way from just having a conversation that involves asking questions and listening to actually going and studying. People orientate their lives around these things, and you don't need a PhD in social work to be able to do something useful in your community, but we do need people that do study things in depth and do come up with appropriate, careful, thoughtful, effective responses to the needs that we see around us.
And as Christians, we're often taught to be good disciples, means to have a prayerful life, to be in God's word, that feeds our soul and provides a light to our footstep, to our feet, to our path. But I don't know if I can ever remember a sermon about practicing justice. Is this something that's part of discipleship or something that's foreign to discipleship?
Well, it's a recurring theme throughout the Bible. It's one of the most dominant themes throughout the Bible. Some people estimate that there's about 2,103 verses across the Bible that talk about God's concern for the poor and for people that suffer oppression and injustice. That means it comes up on average about 1 in every 15 verses. Now, reading the Bible isn't mathematics, but when something keeps coming up, you kind of got to get the idea sooner or later that this is something that is important to God. And so if we are people that want to follow a God of justice, we need to be people of justice. And that isn't just a nice idea, but it's actually getting to the point of doing practical things in our communities and in the wider world that do justice. What does God require? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. That is the really simple, practical thing of what God is asking of his people.
And I guess that's driven out of, love God with your whole heart and love your brother, your neighbour as yourself. Yeah. So obviously then if we have that sort of love, then we're wanting to practice justice. We're wanting to help the widows, the orphans, the needy, the hungry.
And I think love is a key word. And so often love is one of those words that's come to kind of mean everything and nothing. So we can love ice cream, we can love our dog, we can love our mum, we can love our spouse. All of those things are different, but we use the same word. But when it comes down to it, I think a practical definition of love must be something that is active, that is actually transformative.
Yes.
And that, as Cornel West put it, justice is what love looks like in public. That love isn't just rainbows and flowers and puppy dogs and whatever it might be and greeting cards, but it's actually something that is practical, that is that makes a difference, that is seeking the best for that other person, whatever is appropriate in that relationship.
And I love that sort of contrast, because sometimes practicing justice can be hard, can require sacrifice. And later on in our conversation, we'll share some stories of people who've made some significant sacrifices in practicing justice. So you've written a book. Obviously, this is a passion of yours, and it is called Practicing Justice. So what a great great title for a book.
Segue.
And, we'll share a little bit later on of how people can get a copy of that. We'll provide a link in the description. So what drove you to write a book about practicing justice? Was there a collision between, faith and seeing injustice in society? Like, from your own personal perspective, what brought you to this point to focus on this?
And like anything, there's a number of tributaries that become the large river that is the finished product.
Sure.
But, one of the places it started was that I was invited by ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, to speak at a prayer breakfast at the Australian Council for International Development.
Okay.
Now, that's the peak body for Australia's development and justice agencies. And within that, there's quite a number of faith-based agencies.
Okay.
There's the Christian ones, but also the Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, all the different faith-based people that are seeking to, work for these things in the world. And so I was invited to speak for their prayer breakfast at their national conference. And the topic that I was given was, when you're talking about a faith-based agency, what is, how do we connect people that might work for us but that don't necessarily share our faith? How can they engage with the faith roots of the work that we do, and is that important?
Yeah, I see. So what you're saying is, people working with development agencies, relief agencies might not be Christians, but they still buy into the values of helping and serving other people. So is there a role for people who don't have faith?
Yeah, absolutely. Many people do good things in the world for all sorts of reasons. And, we should applaud that wherever it comes from. If people are seeking the good of their fellow human beings, the good of the world as a whole, the good of our communities, that's something we should be pretty excited about, pretty supportive of, on board with, even if they come from it from a quite different worldview or perspective. But I do, and kind of the jumping off point from that into this book was, I think that our Christian faith, and perhaps even our Adventist Christian faith, has something unique and valuable to contribute to that work that so many people are already doing. And so part of my intention with this book was to say, well, for people like that, for young people who might have a passion for justice but haven't really heard it connected to their faith, for people that are just justice activists in the world, but doing justice in a world that is stubbornly and overwhelmingly unjust is really hard work. So what kind of roots can we put down into faith, into the best of what some of our spiritual traditions offer, that can actually be a foundation for doing that work in a way that is healthy for the people you're seeking to serve and for yourself? How can we do it in a way that is sustainable and that has a kind of resilience to it? And it will also shape the ends to which we're working, because, justice can be pretty ugly at times. If we're simply seeking justice and it turns into violence, if it turns into getting revenge, if it turns into some of these other things, which it can kind of tip over into if it isn't well directed and well shaped. And so I guess this book is trying to offer our Adventist Christian faith as a resource and a shaping of this impulse towards justice in the world that many people share.
And you do have some very practical insights, which we'll look at shortly in your book, about how people can do simple exercises to practice justice, so they're not overwhelmed by this daunting challenge
one
before
step
them.
at a time. Yeah.
Okay, so I've read that you've said that justice isn't about winning, and so what's the underlying importance of seeking justice? Apart from feeling good and sure, we make the world a better place, but what are we trying to do by seeking justice or practicing justice?
And I guess to some degree you're asking in a roundabout way, what is the definition of justice when we use that word?
Yeah.
Because, that's a fraught concept in and of itself.
Okay.
And so that's what I'm drawing from in my faith background, and the theology that I put into this book is really, what is the Bible's understanding of justice? Because as I've said earlier, it is a recurring theme. The word keeps coming up. The call to do justice keeps coming up. So what is the Bible actually asking us to do? And the way I understand it is that it's actually God's intention for our world and for our lives. So, in the Bible story, we begin with, not with injustice, but we begin with a world that is perfect, excellent in every way. It is good, God said a number of times throughout the creation story. And so what we see there is this pattern of goodness for human relationships. And I think relationships is very key. It is part of our understanding of who God is and what God is like, and even why God created. But then we recognize that human beings are created for, and I've borrowed this, of course, from thinkers far smarter than I, who point out sort of 4 relationships that human beings are created for. A relationship between ourselves and God, a relationship with ourselves, a relationship with others, and a relationship with the rest of creation. And that so the biggest picture of justice, or even to use a good Hebrew biblical word, shalom, the well-being of all things and the flourishing of all things, is all of those relationships properly ordered or properly healed and restored. So as the Bible goes, that those relationships were all broken, and when we read the story in Genesis 3, you can actually go through that story and see that the relationship with God was broken. They were afraid of God and they hid from him. And then Adam and Eve in this story talks about how they felt shame. They were naked, and so another reason why they hid. Then they start blaming each other for what went wrong. And then we have God's, what are often described as the curses, but the consequences of their fall is that their relationship with the rest of creation is strained and not what it should have been. And so then I kind of understand that the rest of the Bible is the story of God seeking to renew and restore those relationships. And we can well see that the primary relationship is that of God and human beings, God and each of us, but that then has implications that our understanding of the gospel, the good news of what God is seeking to do in the world, is about restoration of those 4 relationships. And when we understand that fully, we have this holistic understanding of salvation and what God's intention is, what God's intention is for our lives and our world and our communities, and that is what we're working towards. So it's when we say we're going to do justice, it may be a larger, more holistic thing than the ways other people use that language.
And I appreciate you showing the depths of those dimensions. And so, as Christians, we long for the return of Jesus when all things will be restored back to the way that they were originally intended to be. But of course, as you've identified, we've got a work to be done in conjunction, of course, to God and the Holy Spirit in that meantime.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk more about Jesus in a moment and the life of Jesus. But there's one character that stands out in my mind and in your book, that when we talk about practicing justice, and it's Dr. King.
Martin Luther King Jr., yes.
And for those who may not be familiar with him, could you just share a little bit about who this man was and what he lived for?
Yeah. Well, he's most famous, I guess, for that great speech, I Have a Dream, 1963, the March on Washington. And he was and he always described himself as, firstly, I'm a Baptist pastor.
Okay.
He was the US civil rights leader in the 1950s and the 60s. As a young pastor, he found himself in the midst of pastoring in Montgomery, Alabama, and Rosa Parks sat on the bus. They then organised as a community and said, well, if you are going to keep segregating the public transport, we're going to walk. And that was kind of the starting point. And for more than a year, they kept up this boycott of the bus system in Montgomery, and were able to force some changes into the legally mandated separation between blacks and whites in that community, in that place. And of course, then that grew from there, with an appeal to the equal rights, the equal respect, the equal dignity of blacks, particularly in the American South, with a series of campaigns across the later 50s and 60s. The core part of the story that I draw on in this particular book is the Birmingham, Alabama campaign in early 1963. And that was the place from which Dr. King wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, which is perhaps one of the best summaries of his work. If anybody wants some homework, that's a pretty good read, apart from my book, of course. And so he was very organised as far as engaging people in the work that he sought to do. And these were public protests. There were marches from city to city. There were sit-ins at on buses and in lunch counters and other places that were segregated. They were working towards the desegregation of schools, and also voting rights was a very significant part of a lot of what they did. And so this happened in various cities, various places, as they were invited by local leaders. And so in early 1963, they were invited to come to Birmingham, which was described as the most racist city in America at that time. Some real, this was risky, life-threatening thing to do, to step into some of these spaces and to stand up for right, for fairness, for justice. And one of the things that caught my attention when I was reading his book, Why We Can't Wait, which is the record of that campaign, was how much it was a religious movement, how much it was a faith-based organising process. And so when they got to Birmingham, the first thing they did is for about 60 nights in a row, they would go around the churches in the community, particularly the black churches, and they were recruiting nights. And so people would be, they'd have a worship service, they'd talk about why they were here in Birmingham, and then they'd say, please sign up to be part of our movement. And of course, people also came from other, students and faith leaders from other parts of the country. But everybody was asked to sign what they called 10 commandments, a commitment card that set out 10 points for the commitment that you were to make and to be part of this movement and to march, but not just to march, but all, it talks about, are you prepared to drive? Are you prepared to type? Are you prepared to make phone calls? Can you cook food? Or even just the basic things. And they asked all of those people to make these commitments and to be trained in the work that they were doing, that this was complicated, difficult, potentially dangerous work. And so what caught my attention and my imagination and sparked that second half of the book was that these are primarily spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. And it underlines that this was a spiritual movement. It had political implications. It had public, it looked like something in public, but it was at its heart, it was led by pastors. It was, bathed in prayer. It was something that was shaped by the traditions of the black church in particular, but also by the broader traditions of Christian work for justice, Christian peacemaking, and all the way back to the teachings of Jesus.
And it certainly wasn't an easy journey, even for Dr. King himself. And I'd just like to share a little extract from the book that just share this as inspiration for our viewers. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit of a story of what happened to him in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And you can picture him home, with his family in bed one night, receives an anonymous phone call. And it's a threatening phone call, and racial, expletives and all this sort of stuff. And if you're not out of this town within 3 days, this anonymous call is saying, they're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house.
Yeah, pretty serious stuff.
That is just a shocking thing to confront. You know, that Dr. King mentioned that his family's asleep in the room next door and struggling with this tension of responsibility to your family, you know, as a guardian and wanting the best for your family, but equally conflicted with this passion that there should be justice in the world and speaking out against injustice. And if I just read a little snippet of what Dr. King said, Martin Luther King, and of course then I want to talk about, well, what can we learn from this, you know, from his example? And sure, he's a man, he's not perfect by any means. Yes. but what can we learn from his faith in action? And here's a little bit of the quote. "And I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And it seemed to me at that a moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even unto the end of the world.'" And what we read is 3 days later, someone did blow up his house.
Yes.
And there was a mob gathering outside. You can understand or expect that people wouldn't have been happy about this act of injustice. And yet Dr. King in this situation was trying to bring about calm and a non-violence form of response to this situation.
He ended up standing on the porch of his house with the smoking ruin behind him. All his family was safe, but he was there and this mob had gathered in front of the house. And he basically preached an impromptu sermon from the front porch of his very badly damaged house, smoke still rising from the back of it, but telling them to lay down their weapons and to, you know, we're better than this, and, you know, the faithfulness that we have is something that is, you know, love is stronger than the bombs. And I guess that, you know, we mentioned the definition of love earlier. You know, we kind of have really strong images. You know, we have these kind of weak, fluffy images of love, and then we have these strong images of violence and hatred in our world. And if we actually believe what our faith teaches us, that love is stronger than that, we need to come up with a working definition of love that is stronger than the worst we see of our world. And I think that's a kind of fascinating way to think about it, and just to imagine love in that way as something that is bigger and stronger than the worst headline, the worst experience of your life. That is the love that God has shown to us, and that we believe is the strongest force in the world, and that God calls us to, as much as we can in working in harmony with him, to express and practice in the world.
And sometimes we see in our news feed where, you know, injustices or accidents, terrible things have happened to families. You know, they've lost their children in an accident or whatever it might be. And it's just so inspiring that in the midst of that hardship and tragedy, that someone can be strong in their faith and seek or offer forgiveness to the perpetrators, you know. And, you know, and I have this picture of Dr. King standing on the veranda as you were speaking of the smoking ruins, like you're saying. Yeah. And, you know, it would have been so easy to say, yeah, let's seek revenge. Let's
smash some things up.
Yeah, let's teach them not to mess with us. But he didn't, you know, and he inspired people to live to those 10 commitments, and of course God's word that taught, you know, love. Yeah. And so, you know, just reflecting on his life and particularly that instant. So what are some of the takeouts for us or from the viewers as we ponder that? So don't respond with violence or with anger, respond with love. Is there any other little insights that we can unpack from that particular instant?
Well, I do. Again, I guess this emphasises the spiritual roots of meaningful, sustainable, resilient, and I guess, you know, justice work that can walk through that kind of very difficult, challenging situation and still remain true to itself. I think that's a really powerful thing, and we can be inspired by that, but also challenged by it, because that's a hard thing to live. And most of us haven't been through an experience of having our house bombed, and most of what we've experienced is less than that. But even we know that we sometimes struggle to love. And to me, this idea of loving is actually seeking the best for that other person. And, even, one of the commitments out of the 10 is that to keep in mind that the work of justice is not about victory, it's about justice and reconciliation.
Okay.
So we're not trying to destroy the other person. We're not trying to destroy, whoever we perceive as the oppressors or the people that are actually, enforcing injustice or practicing injustice. We're seeking to convert them in a way. We're seeking to call them to be the best of the humanity that they are called to be. And I think that's a valuable way of approaching people, in large and small ways, people that we might disagree with, people we struggle with. What would it mean in this situation to seek their good? Jesus gave us the worst case scenario: love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah.
Again, it's really hard to muster nice feelings towards some of these people in our lives. But that's not what we're asked to do. We're actually not commanded to like them. We're commanded to love them. And so if we are simply seeking their good in whatever way makes sense in the context of the relationship that we have, that is a much more concrete thing that we might actually be able to do, even with gritted teeth, perhaps, because we're still human in the midst of all this.
Oh, look, and absolutely, using every strain or fibre of our body to do those things, but we don't have to do it alone, do we? As practicing Christians, it's really relying on the power and I guess the example that Jesus set through the Scripture and through the power of the Holy Spirit that will have strength, I guess, in those sort of situations. Yeah. And, you've mentioned and talked about the 10 commitments. Is there, and this is probably a bit of an unfair question, but is there any one that particularly stands out, to you or that could be particularly relevant to our modern society today, the things that we see happening in the world and our communities? Is there one that you particularly want to highlight?
Oh, can I pick 3?
Yeah, okay, go for it.
To me, there's the first one is to spend time daily with the ministry and teachings of Jesus. And I think that's the number one on the list because that is the foundation for all the others. That we actually need to take seriously this call to follow Jesus, and that isn't just a nice idea. It is something that is truly transformative, radical, challenging, difficult, but also can actually we kind of sometimes assume that Jesus is this kind of, we think of him as a nice sounding guru or something in the teachings that he gave, but we kind of in that way dull down the radical nature of what he taught. And also, a line that fascinates me that I think I quote in the book is, what if we actually assume that Jesus was the smartest person that ever lived, that knew the most about how to live well? And, we kind of, as Christians, we assume that he is someone special. So what if he's someone special with actually meaningful insights and intelligent thinking about how to best live our lives? And then to spend our time, immersing ourselves on a regular basis in what Jesus taught. And I do think that that's something we miss in our Christianity in so much of how it's expressed in the world today. I read something a number of years ago that suggested that in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the most quoted part of what we now call the Bible was the Sermon on the Mount. This was practical living, how to live as an alternative kingdom, the people of God within the realities, injustices, violence, all the challenges of life.
Okay.
And sometimes I don't hear sermons on the Sermon on the Mount very often. It kind of gets, it's cross-stitched with the Beatitudes or, nice slogans and sayings or nice parable stories, but to actually pause and think that actually these might be insights for living meaningfully and living well. And I think that is perhaps a little bit transformative in the way we think about Jesus, that he is God, he is our Saviour, he is a wise teacher.
Okay, so wise teacher.
And I think that's, again, and part of what I try to put across in the book is let's try and experiment with this. What if you spent some time, every day for a month in just focusing on the teachings of Jesus how does that change the way you move through the world, the way you interact with others, the way you live your lives? So that one to me, I think, is the foundational for all the other 9.
Sure.
So I think that's important. But I really like, and I can't remember which number it is on the list, but it talks about simply to practice courtesy to others as part of your everyday practice. And I do like, often when we start the conversation about justice, we're talking about, political rallies or changing laws or, changing whatever, great protest movements or, abolishing slavery or whatever it might be. And so most of us aren't Dr. King. Very few of us are Dr. King or anyone like him as far as being people that can lead and motivate large social movements or political changes or whatever that might be. But we all make choices every day in how we treat the people we interact with and how we live our lives. That there's a difference between doing these big things when those opportunities arise, and for many of us, it may not arise that often in our lives. But each day we choose the small things of how we show our love, grow our relationships with the people around us. And then that in turn shapes us into be the kind of people that when we have the choice, do we stand up for justice or do we remain silent? Do we get involved in this or do we not? We've actually done the practice in all those little things that shapes us, and those muscles are ready to go for the big things.
I love that insight, though, that you don't have to save practicing justice for those big moments in life. What you're saying is it's something we can practice every day. And, we're driving on the roads, and are we showing courtesy to let someone who's struggling to get in from a side street create a gap so they can get in? Or we're impatient in a line and we're always in a rush, but is there a chance to let somebody else in to help them to make their day? Little acts that are practicing justice. And so what I hear you saying is that these are things that help us move to that discipline, become disciples of practicing justice.
And the idea of practicing has 3 meanings that I've drawn into in this book title. The first one is just doing it.
Sure.
Rather than talking about it.
Okay.
That we actually practice it, not just preach it. Second one is the idea of a spiritual practice, that justice can be a spiritual practice, something that shapes us as we do it, particularly in everyday kind of ways, that we become people that are changed by our practice. But the third one is that it's like anything we want to get good at in life. Whether you want to, anything that you want to do, whether it's learning to play the piano or shoot free throws or cook a great meal, all of those things get better with repetition.
Yes.
And so when we do things over and over again, we expect that we will improve, we'll get better, and we'll get to feel more natural for us. And so I do like that idea of just that so much of our faith should be this idea of practicing, doing it day by day, week by week, year by year throughout our lives, that we become different people, and the goodness that we seek to do in the world, to practice in the world, because of our practicing it on a regular basis, becomes a more our muscle, our doing good muscles are kind of growing.
And I love that, because it then becomes the default. It becomes ingrained in who you are, and not something special you do on certain occasions. And you mentioned 3. Do you remember what the third one is?
So the third one is the last one, which is kind of put in very much in the language of the context in which the commitment card was, which was to follow the orders and to do what you're told as a part of a group when you're on a demonstration.
Okay.
But in my application of it, it's simply that we do these things together.
Right.
That, each of us, and you began this conversation with saying, it feels so overwhelming in the world. What can one person do? Well, there's probably not a lot one person can do. There are times, there are amazing times, and there are amazing people that do those things. But for most of us, we might be the guy or the girl or the man or lady, 27 rows back in whatever we're at. We're not in the front row. We're not speaking to everybody, but we're part of a group. And that group can have a much louder voice together than any of us will have individually. That group can be a force, an influence for good and for justice in the world. But it also is something that gives us that kind of community resilience. And when we make a commitment to a group, you kind of will turn up because other people expect you to turn up. Whereas, it can be a challenge sometimes to think that we're going to do it by ourselves. And I mean, it's a fascinating thing in human societies about how we often get this idea that one small person can't make a difference. But then when lots of single small people do something together, it actually becomes this quite amazingly powerful thing. I mean, even to talk about an election, just as a really simple thing, each one of us can say, my vote doesn't matter. But then when everybody does it at the same time, it can change a country. It can change laws, it can change policies, it can change the nature of a society. And there are so many other examples of that kind of thing in our world, in our lives, in our life together. And so that also means we don't have to bear all the load of changing the world on our single pair of shoulders, but that we can work together, we can be part of a larger group of people, particularly when we're doing some of these other things together as well, praying together, learning about Jesus together. And of course, that is church. The logical place for that is that we actually are organised into these community groups that many of us get together with on a regular kind of basis. And it may not be a whole church, but it might be a group within your church, or it might be finding a church that you can be a part of that is also focused on how they can serve their community, how they can make a contribution to the wider world, how they can seek justice, how they can learn together to do some of these things more effectively. One of my favourite verses has become to be Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, which has kind of 5 points for doing justice. The first one is to learn to do good. How can we learn some of the issues, listen, develop our knowledge, but also our skills and abilities and ways of responding. Second is seek justice, so be intentional about doing it, not just expect that justice is going to happen accidentally because we're such good people, but to be intentional and to focus our lives and our energy and attention on what we can do in the world around us. The third one is rescue the people who are being oppressed, so people who have immediate needs. So it's kind of a triage, the last three.
Okay.
So the first one is to rescue the people that are currently in trouble. The hungry person really needs to be fed today. They don't need a change of policy or government plan or whatever. They just need to be fed today.
Yeah.
So people that are suffering right now need an immediate and appropriate response. The second one is to defend the widows.
Okay.
So defending is the people who are kind of vulnerable, the people who are marginalised in our society, the people who are at risk. They're kind of close to being the people that are suffering straight away, but because of their circumstances, because what can we change in their circumstances to help them move away from being vulnerable to being more able to make better choices in their lives, more able to have better opportunities in the community and the world around us. And then the last one is to fight for the rights. And so that's looking at the bigger picture of, human rights might be part of that language, but what does it mean to set up a society in ways that have better policies, better laws, better systems that can support people so that they don't get into vulnerable situations, so that they are less likely to suffer immediate threat or suffering. And so to me, there's kind of a triage there. You focus first on the people that are in immediate need, second on the people who are most vulnerable, and then in the bigger picture, how can we be working together towards building a society, a community, systems that can be more beneficial to people and for building those relationships.
Almost like more the long-term reform that's required to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And, I particularly appreciate the point that you're talking about, that we don't have to do this alone, that when we operate together as community, we can hold each other accountable, but we can support and encourage each other too. One of the 10 commitments that stood out to me too, so in addition to the 3 that you've shared, was the one around refraining from the violence of fist, tongue, and of heart. And, we can understand refraining from the violence of fist, avoid getting into a punch-up with someone. We don't want violence at the end of the day. Refrain from the violence of tongue. So what we say, how we can harass and belittle and abuse people, refrain from that. And of course, refraining from violence of the heart. I'm guessing this is talking about our thoughts, not dwelling on violent thoughts or seeking injustice for other people. And, in this world that we live in where, we're so preoccupied and consumed with social media, we just see proliferation of content that seeks to, create controversy, that seeks to put people down. And
that's how the algorithms work.
That's right. And if you don't stand out and create, controversy, then you're ignored. And so, what a practical application in the world that we're living in now. And I guess, how can we be creative, in seeking ways to practice this too in our life, seeking peace and restraining from violence.
Yeah, and non-violence is a very significant part, I think, of faithful work for justice.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, our impulse for justice can trip over into violence far too easily, particularly with people who are suffering injustice. Particularly, if they continue to be beaten down, the risk of a violent reaction becomes, even Martin Luther King said that often, riot is the language of the oppressed, because, there comes a point with, what else do you do? How do you respond? And this is where the work for justice is so important, because if at all possible, we need to be at that point. We need to be working in those places and contexts before it gets to that point. That's a pretty significant thing. And one can say, well, if we get to the point of violence, there's been a lot of failures along the way, socially, politically, culturally, religiously, spiritually. There are, these things don't come from nowhere. And so this is a reality of our world, that as Christians, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. That's, we need to take that seriously, and not just peacekeepers, but peacemakers, people who are intentional about creating more peace in the world. I think that's a thing we should spend more time learning how to do.
And not only, are we commanded or asked to be peacemakers, but you get better results by being a peacemaker. And you shared some statistics in your book about movements who were violent versus movements who were peacemakers. And typically the peacemakers made more progress. They initiated greater change. And so it works.
Yeah. I mean, one of the examples that is given from the 20th century is Gandhi and the independence movement he led in India, compared to the resistance revolution that happened in Algeria at about the same time. Both countries trying to seek their independence from European colonial powers. And because of Gandhi's influence, I think the stat was that 1 in 400,000 Indians were killed in the political protest. Now, that's still not what you would like, but in Algeria, it was 1 in 10. Yeah, and that was, that is a fascinating thing. And then when you go through and study some of the other examples of history, and I've drawn on some of that research, you're much more likely to end up with a peaceful democratic government if you get there by peaceful democratic means, or at least non-violent protest or resistance, than if you win the argument with guns, you're more likely to keep winning the argument with guns.
So you perpetuate the problem.
Yeah, and so you simply swap out one batch of oppressors for another batch of oppressors. And that's happened far too many times in the history of our world.
So sometimes in life we're given the responsibility of power, and we all have varying degrees of power, whether it's within influence in our family or our workplace or our church, and some are even granted power from a political perspective. There's a concept of power over or power under. What does this mean, and how is it relevant?
Yeah, and this was a really helpful insight, and again, I borrowed it from somebody smarter than I. In talking about Christians in their positioning in political spaces, that we shouldn't be seeking power over, where we seek to impose our will, our worldview, our, what we believe is right and wrong on others. But then instead we should be people that exercise power under, which is about lifting people up, finding the people that are the least of these in society, to borrow the term that Jesus used, and to actually seek their good and their well-being. And it even is this, one of the sort of buzzwords that creates some controversy in our world today is when we talk about privilege. And sometimes you and me as white guys tend to be people say, oh, you're very privileged compared to others, and that has some truth to it. But often when we talk about privilege, what we're actually talking about is what we would desire for everybody. It's not something that we should feel guilty about having. It's something that we want to be able to share with everybody else. Sure. And so, it might be that we are well-fed, that we don't have too many economic concerns, that we are listened to when we walk into a room, that we have a voice of some kind in our work or community or wherever. That's the kind of thing that we would like for everybody. So it's not something we should feel guilty about having, because it is actually what makes good life good, and our lives meaningful, and our opportunities to contribute to the world. And so what we're seeking is not, pulling down people with privilege. It's lifting others up, power under, to be able to experience the, all of the different aspects of what it means to live a good, flourishing human life. And too many of the people in the world today don't experience some of the things that are necessary for that.
So I want to come back to something we were talking about a moment ago, where it's that muscle memory of practicing justice. Yeah. And just share some of the practical exercises. Now, we've talked about some already. Yep. We've talked about practicing courtesy, in our day-to-day, in our workplace, on the roads, whatever encounters we have with people, which is great.
And at each of those chapters, I kind of have that suggestion of try this for a day or try this for a week or try some of these things. And, how does it change your interactions with other people? Because, at times when I'm intentional about those kind of things, it might be, in a shopping mall or an airport or wherever I might be, and just say, hey, I'm just going to let somebody else in line. I'm going to, and all of a sudden, you're having different kinds of interactions with people.
You're right. And you start a different type of momentum, train of thought or feelings or attitudes. And this is really super simple one to start with. So this is about practicing love. Now, this is something surely any of us can do. And the little example task that you give in the book is to choose two people in your life. And so one might be a close friend or a family member. And the idea is to be intentional about seeking good for them and growing in the relationship. Now, that's a great challenge. And then, maybe a little bit more challenging is to choose somebody else. Now, it doesn't mean someone that you've got conflict with, but it could include someone, I guess. But the idea is that someone who you're less connected with, to seek out opportunities to intentionally seek their good and to strengthen the relationship. We talked about restoration of relationships. Yeah. And so just a really simple practical exercise for people, even in the day or this week, just to choose two people you're intentionally working towards and praying for and seeking good for.
And I was kind of prompted a little bit by an experience I'd had, which was a friend of mine from high school. Now, high school's a bit of a distant memory for me these days. And I was in Brisbane for work a couple of years ago, and I'd been posting some things from what I was involved with. And this friend who lives in Brisbane saw what I was doing and that I was in town, and he just reached out to me and said, "Hey, you're in Brisbane, let's have lunch." And I was able to make time to do that. And we hadn't caught up probably for maybe 20 years at that point, or something like that. And he actually said that this was a challenge that he'd been set by his church to do something positive with social media. And I was going, that's kind of cool. And I probably haven't seen him since that time. We haven't just been in the same spaces or whatever. But just to use the things that are the ordinary parts of life intentionally to do something good.
I like it. It's so simple,
Yeah.
but it can have such profound impact on people. Okay, let's try another one. How about this one? This one's a little bit more challenging. Let's check out this. And it's all about, what can I give up?
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes good things require effort in life. And particularly in this instance, the challenge is this. What might you consider giving up to foster or to contribute towards greater justice and freedom in the world? So you talk about, we're not looking for necessarily for heroes or martyrs, but there's a role for those sort of people. But, is there some sort of smaller practice of sacrifice for the good of others? Can you give me some examples of what you might mean by, what are we sacrificing?
Yeah. I mean, I was doing a university subject a couple of years ago as part of a master's program I was doing, and it was a subject on creativity as a part of life.
I like it.
And the lecturer's guy, he'd written a book on what is creativity, and his working definition of creativity is anything that makes space for life, which kind of caught my imagination. And then the challenge that we had, which was one of our assignments for the subject, was to do a personal project that has some creativity to it. And so I was scratching my head. In some ways I do creative things. I even write books occasionally. But what could be something that was kind of different to that? And what I did, and perhaps it wasn't the most profound thing, but I simply said, well, for the period of time, 6 weeks or whatever, I'm not going to buy a drink each day with lunch. I'm just going to drink water. I'm going to save the calories and save the money, and then I'm going to then simply donate that money to a cause, to some justice thing.
Sure.
And so there's a double benefit there. One of them was perhaps a little bit better health, but and a simpler life in that sense, less consumption, all of those kind of things. But then using what I would have otherwise spent in that direction to, for a particular purpose.
Yeah, it's intentional.
I mean, that's a very small thing, but a very, it was, what I appreciated about it was the intentionality. And of course I had to write up a rationale for what I was doing and report on what I'd done and that kind of thing as part of the academic exercise of it. But but I also think that these things can be large or small. Some people it is career defining. That I might choose not to pursue a particular career that might be lucrative, that might be whatever, because I would prefer to serve in some particular role or way or capacity or place.
Yeah.
And so that might be an opportunity for, and perhaps we're not so focused on some of these things as being so. I think there is times for intentionality, but also I think that at times our life, with this practicing that we're talking about, our life becomes shaped in some of these directions, and so they become something that they do. Another example was someone from my church, a friend of mine, who she set up her life so that she works 4 days a week.
Okay.
Every Tuesday, she would have the day off, for well-being, for all the things that you have to do on a day off, all the odd jobs and errands and all those things. But one of the things she programmed into her life was on Tuesday morning, she would get out of bed early, go to the ADRA depot, pick up the van, collect the whatever the food delivery that needed to be done, and drive that out to actually the ADRA Community Centre at Warburton, and that would be the food that they then package up for food parcels. And so she simply said, I probably would sleep in most Tuesdays, but this is something that is just something I have to do because I've made a commitment to do it. It gets me out of bed. It is something that other people are depending on, And I've intentionally just put in as part of my weekly practice of life that I will give up these few hours, and then I'll get back to all the other things I need to do on my Tuesday, work-free Tuesday. And but I just admired that as just that little bit of intentionality that becomes part of your regular life.
Yeah.
And so it's not something you have to choose to do every week. It's just something you do every week. And that makes it so much easier to do it. Because when you have to make the decision week by week, then if you don't feel like it, if you just feel a bit worn out or whatever, you probably won't, some weeks at least. But to do things when you don't feel like it is kind of a little bit of that self-sacrifice that just can become a part of the pattern of your way of living and a spiritual practice in that kind of sense.
And your example reminded me, I was privileged to spend an evening with a pastor in WA, Pastor Lauren Pratt, who operates a charity with a bunch of volunteers called Midland Meals. And we've actually got a video on it, so I'd encourage people to check out that video on YouTube. But like you're saying, feeding people is one way you can spend time to help, sacrificing time and stuff like that, comfort, I guess. But it's something that has to be done, and people are hungry. You need to have faithful people turning up, dedicating their time, sacrificing their time to serve. And I was just so blessed just to see the power of his example, his witness, and the volunteers. And they'd say, whether it's raining or not, they're there in this car park, feeding the hungry people. They put a bit of cardboard up or an umbrella up to provide a bit of shelter while they're cooking the meals. And it's just that intentional commitment of time. It's the sacrifice of chosen, and they're not complaining about it. And we're not all called to serve in that way. But I guess the opportunity is how can we intentionally sacrifice things for good?
What are the things that you can engineer in your life that become a way that you contribute to the world, that you make your community a better place, that you help others? And at different points in our lives and different places, of course, different times and contexts, but even at different stages of our lives, that might look different. I remember when I was at university, there was a group of us that got involved with a youth drop-in centre in a kind of tough neighbourhood in Brisbane. And there was a bunch of older ladies that ran it week by week, faithfully were there every week. We were uni students. We weren't ready to make that kind of commitment. We wanted to go out on Saturday nights with our friends and do all sorts of other things from time to time. We'd turn up there just occasionally. But what we could help them do was that once or twice a year they would run a camp for these street kids and put them on a bus and take them out to one of our church camps out in the hills. And we would go there because the older ladies weren't the people that were going to run on the oval and play games with the kids. We would just turn up for that weekend and we would run and we would do all those kind of physical activities. And that was something that fitted with, the commitment we were prepared to give at that stage of life. And that was a good complementary thing to those good, faithful ladies that turned up week after week and fed them and did all those good things. So, different parts of our lives, we can fit in with some of these things in different ways.
So we're talking about then of seeking opportunities to love, to be intentional about building and restoring relationships, intentionally making someone's life better, sacrificing time. We talked about intentionally practicing courtesy. The other one was talking about practicing engaging in community, that we don't have to start our own organization. If there's one that exists, we can join that and serve with other people, like some of the examples you've been sharing. So there's lots of ways. We want to challenge our viewers to intentionally practice these things in their life too.
And I think the bigger picture we'd also need to keep in mind is, there's kind of in some of the justice talk, there is this distinction between charity and justice.
Okay.
And even when we're talking about the commitments that Dr. King was urging on the people that wanted to work with him, was that we do these things. These can be part of our regular lives, but we're also doing them as part of a bigger process of trying to change the systems that we live in. So we're not just doing short-term charity all the time, and those things are good. Those things are valuable and often necessary. But we also need to step back at times and say, well, actually, we're doing this as part of trying to create some better systems in our communities, in our countries, in our world. We're trying to get to the point where perhaps we don't have to feed hungry people as much every week. I was having a bit of a go at my mum recently. She's a long-term volunteer at a soup kitchen where she lives in Toowoomba, and there's a group of church people that do that, and I'm pretty, I'm impressed that they've been doing it for quite a while now. But I was having a go at her recently, hopefully in a good-natured way, and said, so you've been doing this probably for 10 or 15 years now. Is homelessness getting better or worse in Toowoomba? You're feeding these people week by week. What's being done to address some of the systemic issues in your city? She was saying, well, I'm the old church lady that turns up and cooks lunch for them. And that's good, that's a place. But there also needs to be someone that is, a group of people that are looking at some of the systemic issues. Is homelessness getting better or worse in that community? Is there things we can put in place that can, mean that less people need this service? Can we get some of these people into jobs where they can we employ them to cook the food for other people? So there's lots of questions we can ask if we start to spend time in these spaces. We can start to look around us, and this is part of the learning process, is that if we volunteer in some of these roles, is to start asking the questions about, well, why is it this way? And of course we have, I think it was Bishop Romero, is often quoted as saying, when I fed the poor, I was called a saint, and when I asked why people were poor, I was called a communist. And we need to ask some of those questions to sort of say, well, why do we have to keep feeding the poor? In communities where there is plenty of food, what's going wrong that some people sleep on the streets? How can we address some of those larger issues as well? So that's a challenge that I think that we need to wrestle with in this bigger conversation, and perhaps a corrective to too many of the stories that I'm telling that keep focusing just on, that kind of short-term volunteerism or feeding or housing or whatever it might be. But, can we make a more just society? Can we question some of the assumptions behind our economics and the way some of these things work? Why is homelessness such an issue in Australia? They're kind of the questions we need to spend some time on, and particularly the more we get immersed in working to serve some of these people, we can hear some of their stories. We can listen and learn as we're doing that. And that may take us a step beyond continuing just to turn up and cook soup week by week, as good as that is.
Look, I like that thinking. And, I was watching an interview with a medical professional the other day, and they were talking about, treat the symptoms, but what's causing that problem? Get to the root of the cause and try to treat that problem. What's causing that inflammation or whatever it might be? Yeah. And so, let's treat the symptoms or the output, the problem, but can we get to the root of what's causing that?
And I'm not assuming that we can fix everything and build a perfect society. We put some of those things in God's hands, and we trust that in our Christian story that ultimately the world is recreated when Jesus returns. But the world is changed every day. People are making decisions that make some of these situations better or worse, that exacerbate some of these problems or actually do work to rebuild some of those relationships and grow a fairer society. People are making those decisions day by day. Yeah. Where can we be involved in those decisions? Where can we be influential in those decisions? Where can we contribute to better creative thinking in how our society and our world can be different? That's something that I think we need to put the best of our Christian faithful imagination into, is how can we help people on more than just the bowl of soup and the slice of bread? How can we do something bigger than that?
Nathan, that's a great place to finish. And so I want to thank you for your time. And of course, if people are curious or, desiring more information about practicing justice in their own life, I want to encourage them to pick up a copy of your book, and we'll leave some details and some links where they can buy this book in the description to this video. But look, I've really been blessed by reading it. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for your conversation today.
Very cool. Thank you for your questions.
And want to encourage people that if they'd like to see more content like this, like, subscribe, follow. We'd love to keep on sharing inspiring content that can make a difference in your life and in the life of your community. Thanks.